The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redaphid.com. And distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to the Audio Stash. Today, it is Wednesday, June 13th. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. We can legalize it together. Just visit NORML.org to get involved today. We have a great show for you here today. We'll have our regular Wednesday segment with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Mitch is going to talk about the psychology of persuasion so that we can all better hone our arguments for legalization and make that happen out there. Also on the show today, we'll speak with Cliff Thornton. Cliff is on the NORML board of directors, and he's the founder of the nonprofit Efficacy. Cliff will talk about his work working on prohibition reform. But first up today, we have important breaking news from NORML. Breaking news today from the NORML Foundation in Washington, D.C. New York governor expresses support for medical marijuana access in his state. New York's Governor Eliot Spitzer, the former state attorney general, declared his support this week for medical marijuana access in his state. Spitzer's comments are a reversal on statements he made when campaigning for governor last year. That's when he said he, quote, opposed, close quote, medical marijuana. Spitzer said that advocates of medical marijuana access have persuaded him to change his stance over the last few months. Quote, on many issues, hopefully you learn, you study, you evolve, close quote, Spitzer told media outlets on Tuesday. Governor Spitzer continued, quote, this is one where I had, as a prosecutor, a presumption against the use of any narcotic that wasn't designated purely for medicinal and medical effect, and now there are ways that persuaded me that it can be done properly, close quote. Spitzer's comments come at a time when the New York Assembly is expected to take up legislation that would legalize the use and possession of cannabis for therapeutic purposes. Assembly Bill 4867, sponsored by Assemblyman and Health Committee Chairman Richard Gottfried, quote, allows the possession of up to 2 1/2 ounces of marijuana and up to 12 plants by a certified patient or designated caregiver for medical use, close quote. The measure would also allow medical marijuana to be given or disposed of to a certified patient when nothing of value is exchanged. The Assembly bill is reported to have broad bipartisan support across New York State. Lawmakers have approximately 2 weeks left in this year's legislative session to move forward with the bill. We have links to read the full text of the bill and get involved in NORML's Take Action Center. Those links are at NORMLAudiostash.com. Tuesday here on the Audio Stash, we get the chance to speak with Dr. Mitch Earlywine about the science of cannabis. Mitch is professor of psychology at State University of New York. He's author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book, Pot Politics. We have links to those books online at normalaudiostash.com. Mitch, welcome back to the show today.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Always great to speak with you, Mitch. This week we're going to talk about the power of persuasion. All of us are working very hard to make the case for marijuana legalization. We spoke with Matt Simon earlier this week from sendtherightmessage.com about bringing up the issue with presidential candidates in New Hampshire. So, Mitch, what's the best way to speak about a controversial issue and get people engaged in the issue?
As it turns out, what'll get folks to actually change their mind and what'll actually get them to talk about it in the first place is sometimes two different things. What I'm discovering based on some social psychology research is that this notion of social proof, that other people are talking about it, will get people to talk about it. If you make some kind of reference to somebody who's an authority, that seems to help people get persuaded or at least get willing to talk about it. If you are a likable person, if you're a person who behaves in a likable way, people are more persuaded and more willing to talk about it. And if they think something is scarce, if they think, hey, there isn't a lot of this left, we really got to work this out right now, then they're also very willing to engage under those circumstances.
Mitch, many activists will use a lot of data and statistics. Are the numbers alone effective?
As it turns out, it depends on how the person initially is oriented to the topic. So people who are very well educated on a topic, they like to hear both sides and they love to hear the stats. If they really only know one position and they've already kind of made up their minds in a sort of emotional way, the stats are sometimes a waste of your effort. And so in some ways, what I recommend is ask folks an initial question to sort of get a feel for where they are, and then you sort of know what tack to take. Should I go with the latest data from the drug use surveys, or should I talk about some kind of moral argument or how it all feels?
Now, when somebody already has a deeply held belief, is it psychologically difficult to get someone to change their mind?
It is difficult if you present your argument and say that you're trying to persuade them. Where it gets easier is if you start asking questions instead. And in fact, this comes from the literature on how we get folks to stop using drugs problematically. Rather than saying, hey, you need to pay attention to the prohibition issue because it's really important, you say, hey, tell me what you think about the morality of putting people in jail for certain crimes. And now I start out with a very broad, big issue, something that people would love to talk about, and then as I gradually narrow in on, well, gee, what do you think about, somebody going to jail for owning a plant? You see how it sort of refines, and you're always asking questions rather than telling them things. People love to talk more than they love to listen, but as they're giving you their response to these things, you'll get the clues for, is this somebody who I can hook up to the audio stash? Is this somebody who I can point towards NORML and get them to join? Or is this somebody who I just need to educate with a book or with a simple article or something like that to get them on the path towards entertaining ideas about repealing drug prohibition?
And do these same techniques that work when we're on one-on-ones with individuals, do they work the same for a large group or a mass audience?
The problem with a mass audience is you can't tell where any one person is. So generally, you try to fire a whole lot of different approaches. You try to go at it a whole bunch of different ways. So if you're at an audience who's sort of on your side anyway, it's fun to give them both sides of the argument and talk about how to get there. But if you've got folks who are really opposing you and you really need to convince them, it's better to entertain them with opening up the questions. Let's go ahead and have the questions. Now, if you're a presidential candidate, you're not allowed to have questions. You're only allowed to have answers. So you point out how you're a reasonable person, how you're willing to entertain changing your mind, which is something that's an intriguing thing to actually lay out now, and that you've already got some strong feelings about it, and here they are. And it's funny how when you watch these guys, they're really good at getting the emotion out there, and that seems to be what crowds play to. That's what they seem to enjoy.
So having passion and emotion in the argument, that's just as, if not more important than the hard data that's on our side here.
As it turns out, nobody's ever really changed their mind because of statistics. Nobody really changes their minds for reasons so much as the emotions that those create. The problem has become we're so caught up in the emotions that those create, we think the emotions are all that you need. Usually emotions sway us because they're based on something factual, because they're based on something that's actually in reality, and we've cut out that step, and that's been a problem. But if I'm stuck in I've got a 90-second elevator ride, and I want to persuade somebody to, entertain medical marijuana laws, I'm going to go for the emotional thing just because I feel like that's the thing that's going to be the thing that they'll remember.
And does that emotion, does that passion work both ways? I mean, does the person you're speaking with respond in kind with their own emotions?
In fact, they do, and there's an opportunity to either take that and run with it if it's going in the direction you want when you're the persuader, or to move away from negative emotion by going back to the drier stuff. Let's move back to the statistics. Let's move back to the less personal things and get this negative feeling down in hopes that I can then switch it over. Some new data by my friend George Beiser suggests that people are much more strong about their opinions about what they oppose than what they are about what they support. And so I end up doing things like, don't you oppose racism? Don't you oppose unfair laws? Don't you oppose things that'll get drugs into the hands of teens? And then they're really fired up about these things that they really hate. And once they've got that strong opposing attitude going, then we can start pointing out how marijuana laws as they currently are actually create these things that those folks oppose.
And in your own experience, Mitch, not to put you on the spot here, but what's worked for you?
What's funny is I went around writing Understanding Marijuana with the idea, hey, everybody needs to learn that marijuana is harmless. That's one that they won't entertain. Instead, I'm having much better approach with the idea that it's immoral to throw people in jail for crimes that don't cause any harm. Right? And I start walking through about the idea that, hey, murder, that's something that's really terrible. We definitely want to have a big penalty for that. But, double parking, that's not a big deal. We want to have not much of a penalty for that. Well, where does owning a plant fit on this scale? And suddenly, people are much more willing to entertain that. But if I do the, hey, marijuana is harmless thing, I'm often rebuked so badly that I can't ever get to the idea of we need to change the laws because they're just unfair.
Mitch, this has been a great topic today. We'll likely look at this one again very soon.
I know that was a lot of information all at once. If people are really interested in this topic, Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, is definitely a great place to start.
And we'll have links to that book at normalaudiostash.com today. Mitch, this has been another wonderful discussion here today. I really appreciate you joining us here each week.
All right, take care.
Thanks again, Mitch. Dr. Mitch Earlywine is professor of psychology at State University of New York. He's author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book, Pot Politics. We have links to those books at normalaudiostash.com.
What's up, y'all? This is Soja, and you are right now listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash. Big up yourself.
Joining us on the Audio Stash today for our feature interview today is political activist Clifford Thornton. Mr. Thornton founded Efficacy, a nonprofit focused on drug policy reform. He's been involved with public affairs broadcasting on public radio, served as vice president of the Greater Hartford, Connecticut Jazz Festival, and as a parliamentarian of the Greater Hartford African American Alliance. Cliff has lectured across the country. So effective are his talks that Ocean City, New Jersey, dropped their DARE program after a presentation he gave. Cliff ran for governor of Connecticut last year and currently serves on the NORML board of directors. His website is efficacy-online.org, and we have links to it at normalaudiostash.com today. Cliff, welcome here to the Audio Stash today. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Wonderful to speak with you today, Cliff, and again, thanks for joining us. First, tell us about the experience of running for Connecticut governor. What was that like?
It was most rewarding. It was Plan B of within drug policy reform to get greater notoriety about the legalization of drugs, in particular cannabis.
And what kind of response did you receive from the public during the campaign?
Well, the thing that we all have to realize is that when you run a campaign and it's not solely on drug policy reform, what you're going to get is a mixture of questions. And what I tried to do was to connect drug policy reform with education, with health care, with our economic system. And it played off very well. The people that voted for me, surprisingly, the most of them were conservative Republicans.
Mm-hmm. And although it's an important subject, not many politicians are willing to bring up the issue of prohibition reform in a campaign.
It is a political third rail, and politicians are fearful of being incinerated by talking about drug policy the way in which it should be talked about. However, in the Connecticut State Legislature, there are now more bills than there ever were for criminal justice, and most of those involving drug policy reform. For instance, the medical marijuana at this present time is waiting for the governor to sign it. We're hoping that she signs it or either don't sign it and let it go into effect. That's just one of the things. We have the school zone bill in the state legislature here in Connecticut, and that looks pretty good right now also.
Now, on your website, efficacy-online.org, you talk about legalization being the L word. You know, why is that word so touchy to bring up in politics?
Well, the biggest thing with the L word is this. When you talk about legalization, you're only talking about one thing, the redistribution of income and wealth. And anytime you go into the political arena and you're talking about that, they give you a sideshow about what legalization will do, that the nation will become a nation of drug addicts. And we all know that's not true. They said the same thing about alcohol prohibition, but that didn't occur either. So when you talk about legalization, you're only talking about one thing. You're talking about diminishing the power of that powerful lobby in Washington by the prison guards. That's a very powerful lobby. You're talking about rearranging and not building prisons, because when you look at the overall statistical analysis, what it says is that over 70% of the people in our criminal justice system are there for drug-related charges. And so we're talking about, at the federal level, we're talking about almost 1 million prisoners not being there if drugs are legalized.
Cliff, I want to ask you a question that I ask politicians here on the program to weigh in on. You know, how much do you think prohibition policy has softened up the American public to broader civil liberties violations?
Well, it works like this. The politicians are not all to blame. We have to look at the voting public. When you look at the last 6 presidential elections, what you see is 42% to 53% of the registered voters voted. That's not even counting the tens of millions that have dropped out of the political system altogether. That sends a strong message to the politicians, which says we can do anything we want to do. And see, with the drug war, no one or very few people came to the forefront to stop this criminal justice juggernaut. So that led to Patriot Act 1 and Patriot Act 2, and now we have the Homeland Security and the War Against Terrorism. See, the more the people don't talk about issues, the more they're going to get about what the politicians want to do. It's very important to understand that if the 18 to 25-year-old in this country voted in a 70% percentile rate, there would be a political revolution in this country.
So it's really young people who have the power here. Young people have this issue in their hands.
Yes. They're the ones that's going to have to deal with prohibition, which my generation and the generation before me put in place. So what I concentrate a lot on are the young people, the 16 to 35 range. So if we can get those to vote like they should vote, then we've won the cause, because the majority of young people understand this issue a lot better than the older people, because the younger people don't bring that baggage with them. They don't have it.
And Cliff, you mentioned the medical marijuana bill in Connecticut, and you advocated for that. There's a photo of you on your website with Montel Williams, who also came to Connecticut to testify on behalf of medical marijuana access. I have to ask, we've seen Montel here in New Jersey and in other states testifying before committees for medical marijuana. Is Montel's presence something that's effective with these elected officials?
He's very effective because he's point blank. He tells it like it is. He tells it like what he has to do and how he has to do it. That message, when presented before the Connecticut state legislature, was awfully powerful, and it converted a lot of other people. Just think about this. The deputy speaker of the House, her name doesn't come to me readily, but for years she was totally against this. But once she got a elderly person within her family that was sick, then she changed her mind. And quite a few others within the state legislature experienced a similar thing, and they changed their mind too. Her name is Marie Kirkley-Bay. She is the deputy speaker of the House, and she championed this bill along with 3 other state legislators to push this thing forward. And we were just short of the majority vote within both houses. So if, in fact, the governor didn't sign the bill or vetoed it, it would have been overridden by the majority vote.
Righto. Now, Cliff, we've covered the inherent racial disparity of prohibition enforcement. It's something that exists across the United States. And how do we combat this aspect of prohibition other than, the knee-jerk response that drug warriors use that we should just arrest more white people?
Well, first and foremost, I am not in favor of arresting more white people to equal it out as far as usage is concerned. But this is a very smart policy. If you read Dan Baum's book, Smoke and Mirrors, there is a quote there from Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's staff persons, when he's quoted from Nixon's diary as saying, the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. That very next week, January 17th, 1971, he declared the war on drugs. Now, when we look at the racial issue, true, the figures are overwhelmingly that it is of racial and class disparity. And the reason why the authorities don't incarcerate and convict whites at the level of drug use and drug sale is because if in fact whites went to jail for drug use and drug sale, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because there would literally be armed insurrection in the street, because the white middle class and upper class are not going to stand for their children going to jail for these outrageous drug charges.
Now, we see leaders like yourself, like Montel Williams, addressing prohibition. Cliff, why don't more leaders in the black community take on the prohibition issue head on?
Think about it. Most of the black leaders in this country are bought and paid for, Barack Obama included. And one of the primary objectives with black so-called leaders and activists is that you don't talk about this drug problem if, in fact, you wanted to continue up the ladder within the white structure. And that's what they have complied with. Jesse Jackson said decades ago that anyone coming out against the drug war will be viewed as a traitor.
And how about, those figures in the entertainment industry as well, say like P. Diddy? We've seen photos of actually smoking marijuana at places like celebstoner.com or massively influential folks like Russell Simmons. What keeps them away from the prohibition fight?
The same thing that I talked about before. I mean, even though they espouse black rhetoric, they are basically cowards, and they're bought and sold. I mean, you can talk about Cornel West. You can talk about people like Bill Cosby and Halle Berry, or the singer that was arrested in Japan. And, when you talk about race, you've got to talk about class, because overwhelmingly the people within the criminal justice system for drug charges, true, they're black, brown, and poor white. However, they are overwhelmingly from the same socio-economic class. So it is not only a race and class war, it is also a economic war.
And does prohibition keep these class castes in place in America, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of things you have to look at and try and understand the progression of how it is today. You have to go back to the civil rights movement and look at the civil rights movement. Sure, it was, in many respects, it was very positive, but what it did was it created an even greater class divide within the black community. Because I remember growing up within the black community, and any of the leaders, be they lawyers, politicians, doctors, or whatever, they were all within the same neighborhood, and you could get to them and talk to them. That no longer exists. By having the civil rights movement, it created a tremendous vacuum where the pimps and the hustlers moved in, whereas before the civil rights movement, the high crime areas, or the red district areas, as they were called during that particular time, they were in just one part of the city, and they were not allowed to expand to other areas. So when you look at how the civil rights movement shaped America, we've got to talk about that particular aspect also, about the divide, the even greater divide that the civil rights movement created, which left drug prohibition right in that vacuum to spread and proliferate within not only the black community, but the brown community and the poor white community.
We're with NORML Board of Directors member Cliff Thornton. His website is efficacy-online.org, and we have links to it at normalaudio-com. Cliff, let's look at the hypothetical of when the L word, when legalization happens for marijuana. What happens then?
Well, there's a couple of things you have to look at. First and foremost, if cannabis were legalized, anywhere from 60 to 80% of the so-called drug policy movement will be gone, because most of the people that are in this movement are in for the purpose of legalizing cannabis. Now, it would be pretty tough. I understand and realize that cannabis is definitely the key, and it's not cannabis that they're really after. They don't want hemp legalized. So that's the way in which I look at that. I think you have to look at it holistically, because cannabis does not cause the crime and violence that the other illegal drugs do. And if you don't try and bring all of them in at once, then I think it may be much more difficult, because of the people within the drug policy reform movement will probably be gone. The thing that we have to thoroughly understand is that the real work does not start until we bring these drugs inside of the law. We think we have it rough now getting to the table to articulate our views on legalization. It's going to be as tough if they just legalize cannabis and we don't have all of those people working for drug policy reform.
And how about the economic opportunities for many across the country when legalization takes place?
Well, when you talk about economic development, sure, there is the potential with cannabis and hemp to produce a tremendous cottage-type industry throughout this country. The thing that I look at is that we can't have legalization without indemnification. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International said anytime that there's a war against a particular people, then reparations are in order. I don't want to see legalization without indemnification. There has to be a strong economic component to replace the underground economy, because we've become dependent upon the sale and distribution of illegal drugs. And I'll give you an example. The police chiefs of Camden and Paterson, New Jersey, came out publicly and said that if drugs were legalized, the city would collapse financially. And privately, the police chiefs of Los Angeles and Philadelphia and New Orleans have said the same thing. So that makes one think now, if in fact we do legalize these drugs, how are we going to replace this underground economy? And I look at one way, and not even talking about the shift of monies from the drug war to social type programs, I'm looking at the taxation for cannabis and hemp, for those taxes to go back into those areas to build up those cottage industries with cannabis and hemp.
That's a truly fascinating concept you brought up there, Cliff. You know, Philadelphia and Camden are both cities that I am personally intimately knowledgeable of, having worked as an activist in both areas. And to hear that from the police chiefs, it's a stark reality. You know, when we talk about these underground economies, I found that people who live in those urban environments often turn to these off-the-grid underground economies simply because they're one of the very few, very limited economic opportunities available in those areas.
Starting point, but there's many variables to that, and it's too long to go in for this particular program. But yes, you are basically correct that when you look at the almost 4 decades of this drug war, there's been an estimated 20 million children orphaned because one or both parents were serving time for illegal drugs. Now, when you start to look at the domino effect that has, you begin to realize that much of the problems within the black and brown and poor white community comes from illegal drugs somehow or some way. So when you don't put this issue through the critical thinking, perhaps with legalization without indemnification would be actually worse than what we have right now, because at least there's money floating from the illegal drug trade, but once you take that away and it's gone, that's got to be replaced with something else.
Cliff, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Cato Institute in Washington to hear authors present their book, Lies, Damn Lies, and Drug War Statistics, that lays out these false claims made by the ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. You know, one of the things the authors put forth in their book is that those underground economies are tapped into so easily by our own arms of military and government. We saw this exposed during the Iran-Contra affairs very clearly. But this lucrative underground economy, funding some of our own clandestine activities, and not to bring up a big C word, you know, the conspiracy word, but, you know, is this a big factor in why prohibition remains in place?
That you hit the nail on the head, and that answers a lot of your previous questions. That is absolutely correct, because you've got to realize that this underground money, and it's been estimated at $500 to $800 billion underground economy worldwide, and within the United States, we're talking anywhere from $2 to almost $400 billion within the United States. So yes, this money, in many respects, finds its way back to the coffers of political leaders that are running for office, which dictates that they will be tough on crime and stay tough on crime. So yes, it is a situation that should be examined thoroughly, but the key is getting it to the press. Now, once an issue like this hits the press, it is basically squelched and not perpetuated. And when you do the comparisons about these things with the Iraq War and the economy, and basically this country spends $100 billion a year to thwart drugs from this country, and that averages out to about $2 billion a week, and that's comparable to the Iraq War. So we've missed the boat purposely to keep this particular issue of drug policy reform at the lowest level possible so we don't incite the people.
Well, Cliff, this has been a great conversation today. I really appreciate you taking time to join us, and I look forward to having you back on the program again.
It's my pleasure, Chris. You have a great day.
Thank you again, Cliff. Cliff Thornton founded Efficacy, a nonprofit focused on drug policy reform. He's on the NORML board of directors. His website is efficacyonline.org, and we have links to it at normalaudiostash.com. You've been listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow.